The doorbell. It was an ordinary evening, just like any other. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The gentle hum of cars passing by, the soft rustling of trees in the cool breeze, and the distant laughter of children playing outside filled the air. In a small, modest home tucked at the end of Maple Drive, the dinner table was set, and the evening routine was beginning for the Thompson family. Betty Thompson, a 78-year-old widow, had long since lost her husband, Walter, and her children had moved out years ago. Her days were filled with quiet tasks, watering her garden, tidying the house, and watching old movies on the television. She was content in her solitude, if not entirely at peace with the absence of her loved ones. There were days when the silence felt deafening, and nights when the house seemed too big, too empty. But Betty had learned to live with it. She had learned to adapt. Tonight, though, there was something different about the air. Betty couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to change. It wasn't a loud, intrusive sensation. No, it was a quiet tugging at the back of her mind, like a forgotten memory just out of reach. The doorbell rang. Betty froze. It wasn't common for anyone to visit her unannounced. She shuffled toward the front door, her arthritis creaking in protest with every step. With a hesitant hand, she turned the knob, and the door swung open to reveal two small figures standing on her porch. At first, she didn't recognize them. Two little girls, twins, perhaps, each no older than 8 or 9, with wide, innocent eyes that glistened in the dim porch light. Their clothes were worn, their shoes scuffed. The taller of the two, dressed in a faded red dress, stepped forward and spoke in a soft, timid voice. "Ma'am, can we come inside?" she asked, her words barely a whisper. Betty blinked, unsure of what to say. "Are you lost?" she asked, glancing down the street as if expecting someone to be walking toward her, but there was no one in sight. The other twin, a smaller girl in a blue dress, clutched her sister's hand tightly. There was something strange about their demeanor, something that unsettled Betty. They didn't look like children who were playing, but rather like children who were hiding. Something was off, but Betty couldn't put her finger on it. "We're not lost," the taller twin said. We need help." Betty's heart tightened. "What kind of help?" she asked, her voice softer now, sensing the tension in the air. The twins exchanged a quick glance, and for a brief moment, Betty felt like she was peering into something dark, something they weren't meant to know. The taller twin leaned in, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper. "They told us not to tell anyone, but we have to. We have nowhere else to go." Betty's breath caught in her throat. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise, the pit of her stomach tightening as though something inside her knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end like she had hoped. "Please, Miss Thompson," the girl continued, her voice trembling. "We need help. We're not safe." Betty stepped back instinctively, her old instincts kicking in. The world around her seemed to slow, the noises of the neighborhood muffling as she looked into the girl's eyes. They were scared, but what frightened Betty the most was that she couldn't tell what they were scared of. "Come inside," Betty said finally, her voice firm but kind. She opened the door wider, beckoning them in. The twins stepped inside hesitantly, their eyes darting around the room as if searching for something. Betty closed the door behind them, locking it quietly before leading them into her living room, where the warmth of the old fireplace flickered softly. She sat them down on the couch, offering them the same comfort she had once offered her own children. "Now, tell me what's going on," Betty said, her voice gentle yet insistent. The silence that followed felt thick, heavy with anticipation. She could almost hear their thoughts, racing with fear, doubt, and confusion. The twins exchanged another glance. It was the smaller one, the one in the blue dress, who spoke first. They're hurting us," she said, her words faltering as she tried to hold back tears. "We don't know what to do. We've been hiding, but we can't anymore." Betty's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a punch in the gut. Who could hurt two innocent little girls like this? The thought made her stomach churn with disgust. She reached out, placing a hand on the smaller girl's shoulder, trying to comfort her as best as she could. "Who's hurting you?" Betty asked, her voice trembling slightly. The room grew colder as the twins' faces darkened, their eyes shadowed with fear. The older twin finally spoke again, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "It's our father," she whispered. He's not who he seems." Betty's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, she couldn't process what she had just heard. The father? No, it didn't make sense. "Are you sure?" Betty asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you certain?" The older twin nodded, her small hand gripping her sister's tightly. "We can't stay there anymore. Please, you're the only one who can help us." Betty sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The weight of their confession was overwhelming. It didn't make sense, yet it was undeniably real. She looked at the girls, their faces pale with fear, their eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to believe them. Betty's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, the enormity of the situation settling in her chest like a stone. There was no time to waste. She had to do something. But what could she do? As her fingers hovered over the keypad, she realized one thing. Their lives had just become entwined, and no matter the cost, she would protect them. Betty dialed 911. The unraveling. As the weeks passed, Betty Thompson could feel the weight of the secret resting heavily on her heart. Every time the twins knocked on her door, it was like they were dragging her into a darker world. A world she wasn't sure she was strong enough to navigate. Their secret, the one that had shattered her quiet life, was something she could hardly believe. Yet the twin girls were so sincere, their eyes so full of the truth, that Betty couldn't ignore it. The girls, Tiffany and Marie, had not just visited Betty for a casual chat. Every time they came, they revealed a new layer of their pain, and it was beginning to eat away at her. Tiffany, the older of the two, was usually the first to speak. With her soft voice and hesitant words, she spoke of strange encounters with people who didn't seem to belong in their small neighborhood. People who had made promises to their mother that they would one day take them away to safety. Marie, on the other hand, was quieter, her eyes darting nervously, as if afraid of someone hearing their words. But it was the third visit that pushed Betty to the brink. This time, as the girls entered her home, their expressions were more desperate than usual. Tiffany's hands were trembling as she clutched a small, worn-out book to her chest. The book was old, maybe decades old, and there was something oddly familiar about the cover, though Betty couldn't place it. "Grandma Betty, we need your help," Tiffany whispered, looking over her shoulder to ensure they weren't being followed. Betty crouched down to their level. "Of course, honey. Whatever it is, you know you can trust me." Mary finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mama," she said, eyes wide with terror. She's been meeting people. Bad people. We don't know what they want. But we're scared." Tiffany nodded, biting her lip. "She told us to never tell anyone. But the things she says, the things she does. It's like she's not even our mom anymore." Betty's heart tightened in her chest. She wanted to brush it off, to reassure them that it was just some innocent misunderstanding, but something about the weight of their words stuck in her mind. The fear in their voices was real, and she couldn't ignore it. "I think it's time we talk to someone," Betty said, her voice shaking. "Maybe the police, or maybe I can help you too. But we need to be sure, okay? Can you show me what's been happening?" Tiffany opened the book, revealing pages filled with strange symbols and cryptic messages, things Betty couldn't begin to understand. There were pictures, too, of the girl's mother, looking far different than Betty had ever seen her. The woman in these pictures was eerily cold, a far cry from the warm, loving mother she had known. The girls explained that their mother had changed. A few months ago, she started speaking in riddles, things that made no sense to them at all. And now she wasn't just changing the way she acted. There were things happening at night, things they could hear through the walls. Whispers, shadows shifting in the dark, and a sense of dread that would not go away. Betty felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what this was, but whatever it wasn't right. "Where did you get this book?" Betty asked, her voice a little more forceful now, as she gently closed the worn cover. Tiffany and Marie exchanged uneasy glances. "It's Mama's," Tiffany admitted. "She told us to never touch it, but we did. We were curious, and we thought if we could understand what she was doing, we could stop her from hurting us." Betty reached out and touched the book, feeling an unexpected pulse of energy in her fingers, as if the pages themselves were alive, throbbing with a sinister energy. The air around her grew heavy, and she had to steady herself against the edge of her dining table. "This isn't something I can figure out on my own," Betty murmured. "But we'll find a way. I promise you both." With her mind racing and a deep sense of foreboding, Betty knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a family secret. It was something darker, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The very next day, Betty made the decision that would change everything. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but she couldn't just sit idly by while the twins lived in fear. She called her longtime friend, Anita, who was a respected member of the local church, hoping she could help make sense of the girls' troubling story. Anita had lived in this town her whole life and knew people who might be able to assist in a situation like this. Anita listened carefully as Betty described the twins' visits and their mother's disturbing behavior. After a long pause, Anita's voice was quiet but firm. "Betty, you need to be careful. This sounds like something more than just a few bad choices. There's something dangerous happening here, something that you might not be able to control." Betty nodded, her heart pounding. "I know, but I have to do something." Anita agreed to meet with her the next day, and Betty couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the twins weren't just hiding from a mother who had lost her way. They were hiding from something far worse, something they were afraid to speak of. But Betty was determined to help them. She wasn't sure how, but she would protect those girls from whatever darkness loomed over them. With a sense of urgency, she hung up the phone and looked out the window. The sky was an eerie shade of gray, as though the world itself was holding its breath. As Betty prepared for her meeting with Anita, she realized that the most frightening thing of all was not knowing what they were truly up against. Would they be able to stop it, or had they already walked too far down a path from which there was no return? For the first time in her life, Betty Thompson wasn't sure she could protect those she loved. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when the danger had already knocked on her door. This story was just beginning. The hidden truths unraveled. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon when Malik Weston received a frantic call from his daughter, Maya. He was still at work, the steady rhythm of typing on his computer interrupted by the ringing of his phone. He recognized her voice immediately, a tone laced with a mix of fear and frustration. She'd barely been able to get a word out before he cut in, reassuring her that everything would be okay. "Dad, I don't know what to do," Maya had sobbed. "Calm down, sweetheart. What's going on?" Malik responded, his voice steady but laced with concern. He could hear her taking shallow breaths on the other end, her mind racing. "It's about my teacher, Mrs. Bellamy," Maya began, her words stumbling over each other. "I think she's trying to hurt me." Malik's heart skipped. His initial thought was that this had to be a misunderstanding. Mrs. Bellamy had always been well regarded by the parents in the community, but something in Maya's voice struck him deeply. This wasn't a child's overreaction. This was something serious. "Why do you think that?" Malik asked, standing up from his desk, his mind already beginning to race with possibilities. It's the lunches. She keeps making me eat them. All the other kids get their regular food, but mine, Mine's different. Every day. Maya's voice dropped into a whisper as though even speaking the words aloud could make them too real to bear. Malik felt a cold pit form in his stomach. A teacher's treatment of a student was one thing, but to involve food in such a way, he could barely fathom the implications. He pressed his daughter for more details, and as she described her daily experience, how the lunches were consistently off, strange, even unappetizing, a gut-wrenching realization set in. Something was deeply wrong. The next morning, Malik woke early, his mind already consumed with the weight of his daughter's revelation. He called into his boss at the community center to let them know he'd be taking a personal day. There were more important matters to attend to. Arriving at Maya's school, Malik was struck by the sudden, suffocating silence that seemed to hang over the building. The sound of his shoes echoed down the hallway as he walked towards the administration office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting an eerie glow on the beige walls. When he entered the office, the secretary, Ms. Davenport, looked up in surprise. She had always been friendly when he had visited before, but today there was something off in her eyes. She forced a smile. "Mr. Weston, is everything okay?" she asked, though the tone of her voice suggested she knew something wasn't. "My daughter," Malik said, his voice tight. "I need to speak with Mrs. Bellamy. It's urgent." Ms. Davenport hesitated for just a moment too long. "Of course," she said, grabbing the phone and dialing the teacher's room. As he waited, Malik could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something about this felt wrong, like there was more lurking beneath the surface. When Mrs. Bellamy arrived, she was a picture of calm professionalism, her immaculate appearance and poised demeanor seemingly at odds with the tense energy in the room. "Mr. Weston," she greeted him with a too-casual smile. "How can I help?" Malik tried to steady his breathing, his gaze narrowing slightly as he met her eyes. "I've come to talk about Maya's lunches," he said bluntly. "She says they've been strange, different from the other children's meals. I want to know why." For a moment, Mrs. Bellamy's expression faltered, but only briefly. It was as if she had been caught off guard, but her mask quickly snapped back into place. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, feigning confusion. "We have a standard lunch program for all the children. You're telling me Maya is receiving the same meals as every other student?" Malik pressed, the tension rising in his voice. "Yes, of course," she replied, her tone defensive. "But I've noticed Maya doesn't always eat her lunch. She tends to leave it behind or barely touches it. I assumed she just didn't like it." A cold knot formed in Malik's chest. The story didn't add up. Maya had never had problems with food before. She'd been a healthy eater, always eager for meals. Why would she refuse the food? His instincts screamed that there was more here than met the eye. "I need to see what she's been eating," Malik demanded. "I need to see the lunches you've been giving her." Mrs. Bellamy hesitated, and for just a moment, Malik could have sworn he saw a flicker of something, guilt, fear, pass over her face, but it was gone in an instant. "Of course, Mr. Weston," she said, her voice now more tight and controlled than before. "I'll have the record sent to you." As Malik left the school, his thoughts raced. He had only just scratched the surface of whatever was happening to his daughter, and there was something deeply sinister about it. His daughter had been quiet for weeks, but now he understood why. She hadn't just been avoiding lunch. She'd been trying to avoid something far worse. When he returned home, Maya was sitting in her room, nervously glancing up when he entered. Her wide eyes were filled with a silent plea, as though she were scared to tell him anything more. But Malik wasn't going to let it go. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this, Maya," he said softly, sitting beside her. "I don't care what it takes. I will protect you." As Malik comforted his daughter, he knew he had only begun to uncover the layers of what was happening. The story didn't end here. There was much more he needed to uncover. And if the teacher was involved in something darker than lunchroom issues, Malik wasn't going to rest until it was all exposed. The truth was hidden, but Malik would dig deeper, no matter the cost. The walls of deception began to crumble. Marcus had always considered himself a good father. Ever since his daughter, Amara, was born, he had dedicated himself to being her protector, her guide, and her unwavering source of strength. But in recent weeks, something in his gut had started to twist. It was as if the universe had placed a series of red flags right in front of him, just beyond his line of sight, daring him to look closer. And so he did. When Amara's behavior began to change, the sudden disinterest in school, the constant exhaustion, the strange bruises that would appear and disappear without explanation, Marcus had known that something was off. He had tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pressure of school. Maybe she was growing into adolescence. But deep down, he had felt the stirrings of something darker. One particular evening after a long day of work, Marcus came home to find Amara sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. Her eyes were bloodshot, her shoulders slumped in a way that made her appear much older than her 12 years. There was no spark in her gaze, no energy in her movements. She seemed like a shell of the girl he once knew. "Amara," he had called softly, sitting next to her. "We need to talk." She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flickered to him, but there was no real recognition. The way she looked at him, like a stranger, sent a jolt through Marcus's chest. "Sweetheart, what's going on?" he asked, his voice strained with concern. "Are you okay? You've been different lately. You can talk to me." The words hung in the air between them, but Amara simply shook her head, her lips trembling as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. Marcus reached out and gently cupped her face, feeling the warmth of her skin against his hand. "You don't have to hide from me, baby," he said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." And then, without warning, Amara broke down. Her sobs were quiet at first, almost like the air was holding them back. But as the minutes passed, her body shook with the weight of something she had been carrying in silence for far too long. It's him, Daddy. Mr. Randall. He keeps touching me." The words hit Marcus like a freight train. His chest tightened, and the world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. The room felt suffocating, and he struggled to breathe as he tried to process what she had just said. Who is Mr. Randall?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his mind was already racing. Amara's face crumpled in on itself as she spoke, her words coming out in broken gasps. "He's my teacher. He does things when no one's looking. I didn't know what to do, Daddy. I was scared." Anger, rage, and a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow boiled inside Marcus, but he held himself together. He had to stay calm. For her, for his daughter, who was now broken in ways he couldn't even comprehend. "Amara, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "You did the right thing by telling me. You are so brave. No one, not ever, has the right to touch you like that. Do you understand?" Amara nodded, her body still shaking with the weight of her confession. Marcus kissed her forehead, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. His mind was already moving, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit into place. Mr. Randall. The name alone made his blood boil. He had heard rumors, whispers at PTA meetings, hushed conversations from other parents, but never had he imagined this. His daughter was in pain. His daughter was a victim. "I'm going to take care of this, Amara," he promised, his voice full of conviction. "I'm going to make sure he can never hurt you or anyone else again. But first, I need to call someone." Marcus grabbed his phone, his hand shaking slightly as he dialed a number that would change everything. 911. His heart pounded in his chest as the operator picked up. 911. "What's your emergency?" "My name is Marcus Davis," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "My daughter has been abused by one of her teachers. His name is Mr. Randall. I need help. Now." The operator's calm, professional voice filled his ears, But Marcus was only half listening. All he could hear in his mind was Amara's sobs, the image of her broken and bruised, afraid to speak up until it was almost too late. But he would make sure that it wasn't too late. He would see to it that Mr. Randall would pay for what he had done. After the call, Marcus sat down beside Amara again. "I called the police, sweetheart. They're coming. You did the right thing. And now he's going to be stopped." Amara's face was a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that it was finally out in the open, but fear of what would come next. Marcus couldn't blame her. This was a nightmare no child should ever have to face, and it was far from over. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened next, Marcus would be there. He would fight for her. He would destroy anyone who tried to take advantage of his precious girl. The doorbell rang a few minutes later, and Marcus opened it to find 2 police officers standing on the porch. He barely registered their names as he led them inside, guiding them to where Amara sat on the couch, still trembling but holding her head high. He gave them a brief rundown of the situation, and they began taking notes, their professionalism and empathy a small comfort in the chaos that was consuming Marcus's world. But all he could think about was the moment they would go to Mr. Randall's house, the moment they would confront him, the moment they would bring him to justice. He glanced over at Amara, who was clutching a pillow to her chest, her tear-streaked face still a reflection of the pain she had endured. The anger bubbled up in Marcus again, fiercer than before. How dare anyone hurt his daughter? How dare anyone hurt any child? But for now, there was nothing he could do but wait for the police to do their work. And as he sat beside Amara, whispering words of comfort to her, he vowed that this would not be the end. This was just the beginning of the fight to protect his daughter, to protect all the children who had ever been hurt. And Mr. Randall would pay. The confrontation. Marcus stood in the corner of his living room, watching as the officers gently spoke with Amara. Every word out of his daughter's mouth was a fresh wound, slicing deeper into his already shattered heart. His fists clenched at his sides, his body tense, as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Yet he stayed rooted in place, knowing that one wrong move could jeopardize everything. The officers, Detective Laura Harris and Officer Benjamin Ortiz, were methodical and compassionate. Laura, with her calm demeanor and understanding tone, seemed to ease Amara's fear. Benjamin, standing nearby with a notepad, took diligent notes, occasionally nodding to himself. They asked questions carefully, ensuring they didn't overwhelm her while extracting the details they needed. "Did he ever say anything to you while this happened, Amara?" Laura asked, her voice soft but steady. Amara hesitated, glancing at her father. Marcus nodded, silently reassuring her that she could say anything. He told me it was our secret," Amara whispered, her voice trembling. "He said I couldn't tell anyone or he'd get in trouble and that it'd be my fault." Marcus felt his blood boil. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arm of the couch for support. How dare this man manipulate and harm his child? How dare he instill such fear in someone so innocent? He wanted to storm out of the house and confront Randall himself, but he knew that wasn't the answer. Not yet. Laura exchanged a glance with Benjamin before placing a comforting hand on Amara's shoulder. "You did the right thing by telling your dad, Amara. None of this is your fault, and we're going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Amara nodded, a faint glimmer of relief crossing her face. Marcus saw it, and it gave him a sliver of hope that she would begin to heal. But that hope was short-lived. They still had to deal with Randall. "Mr. Davis," Laura said, standing and turning toward Marcus, "we'll need to involve child services to ensure Amara gets the support she needs. In the meantime, we'll begin the investigation. Do you have any idea where Mr. Randall might be right now?" Marcus folded his arms, his jaw tight. "He should be at the school. He's a teacher. If he's not there, I'll find him." Laura raised a hand, signaling for calm. "We'll handle it. I understand how difficult this is, but we need to proceed carefully. These cases require evidence and protocol to make charges stick. We don't want him slipping through the cracks." Marcus nodded reluctantly, though every fiber of his being wanted to take matters into his own hands. "What's the next step?" "We'll head to the school to speak with him," Laura explained. "We'll also secure access to his personnel records, classroom surveillance, and any other materials that could help corroborate Amara's account." Benjamin added, "It's crucial that we don't alert him prematurely. If he knows we're coming, he might destroy evidence or even flee." Marcus nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Just promise me he'll pay for what he's done. Promise me my daughter will get justice." Laura met his gaze, her expression firm. "That's why we're here, Mr. Davis. The investigation begins." By the time Marcus arrived at the school alongside the officers, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the empty parking lot. The building, once a place he had trusted with his child's education, now felt foreboding. Its looming structure seemed to mock him, a reminder of how much had gone unnoticed. The school's principal, Mr. Garrett, greeted them at the front entrance. His face was a mix of confusion and concern as Laura explained the situation. "Detective Harris, this is troubling to say the least. I've never had any complaints about Mr. Randall before. Are you sure about this?" "Amara's statement is detailed and credible," Laura said firmly. "But we need your cooperation to access his records and ensure the safety of other students." Mr. Garrett nodded, though his hesitation was clear. "Of course. Follow me." They were led to Randall's classroom, where the faint smell of markers and paper lingered in the air. The room was eerily quiet, its cheerful decorations and colorful posters at odds with the sinister reality Marcus now associated with it. Laura began scanning the area, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Benjamin moved to the desk, opening drawers and sifting through papers. Marcus stayed near the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He didn't trust himself to speak. Being in the same space where Randall had hurt his daughter was almost too much to bear. As Benjamin rifled through one of the drawers, his hand paused. "Detective," he called, holding up a small USB drive. "Found this tucked behind a stack of papers." Laura took it, examining it closely. "We'll need to analyze this back at the station. It could be nothing, but it's worth checking." Mr. Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "I'll have our IT department pull any surveillance footage from the hallways and classrooms. But, Detective, I hope you understand what kind of uproar this could cause. If this goes public." "If," Marcus interjected, his voice sharp. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "My daughter was assaulted, and you're worried about publicity. Maybe you should be worried about how long this was allowed to happen under your watch." Laura placed a calming hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Mr. Davis, we'll address all concerns, but right now we need to focus on gathering evidence." Mr. Garrett cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'll get the footage. Excuse me." As the principal left, Laura turned to Marcus. "I know this is hard, but you're doing the right thing by letting us handle it. I promise we won't stop until we have everything we need to put him away." Marcus nodded, though the anger in his chest refused to dissipate. He glanced around the room again, his gaze landing on a photo on Randall's desk. It was a picture of Randall with a group of children, smiling broadly. The sight made his stomach churn. How many of those kids had he hurt? How many had stayed silent, too scared to speak up? "I just want justice for Amara," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She deserves that much." Laura nodded. "And she'll get it." The unmasking. As they left the school, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The USB drive, the surveillance footage, and the documents they had retrieved would likely reveal more than they anticipated. He could feel it in his gut. Randall wasn't just a predator. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. Back at the station, Marcus sat in the waiting area as the officers worked. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew palpable. When Laura finally emerged, her expression was grim. "What did you find?" Marcus asked, standing immediately. Laura hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The footage confirms Amara's account. We also found disturbing material on the USB drive. It's enough to secure an arrest warrant." Marcus felt a wave of relief and rage wash over him. Relief that they had the evidence to act, and rage that such a man had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. "We're moving in tonight," Laura said. "He won't see it coming." Marcus nodded, his fists clenching. He wouldn't rest until Randall was in cuffs. For Amara, for every child who had ever suffered in silence, the battle wasn't over, but this was a step toward justice, and Marcus would make sure justice was served. The reckoning. The days that followed were unlike any other in Betty Thompson's life. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon, marked by the sudden visit from the twin girls, had spiraled into something that shook the very foundation of her understanding of the world. The secret they revealed to her was something she could never have imagined. Their mother, Monica, was her closest friend, and now she stood in the eye of a storm, trying to make sense of what she'd learned. Betty had never known what it was like to hold a heavy secret. She had lived her life with honesty, with transparency, and with a love for her community that had earned her the trust and affection of everyone around her. But now, with the weight of this devastating truth pressing on her heart, she couldn't help but wonder if there was any way she could still fix things. She had always loved Monica like a sister. They had laughed, shared stories, and comforted each other through the inevitable hardships life threw their way. They had spent countless evenings together in Betty's home, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing, finding solace in each other's company. They had never shared a darker side of life, never hinted at the deep secrets each of them carried in their souls. But now, as she paced the creaky floors of her house, Betty couldn't escape the fact that Monica's past was more complicated and destructive than she had ever imagined. The story the girls had told her, that their mother was being coerced into taking on dangerous, illicit jobs, was terrifying. Yet the more Betty thought about it, the more she realized that the seeds of Monica's pain had likely been planted much earlier. It was so clear to her now that Monica had never been the same since her husband died, leaving her to raise 2 children alone. Betty had been there for every step of it, from the funeral to the quiet evenings when Monica would cry into her shoulder. But even then, there had been something off. Betty had chalked it up to the pressures of single motherhood, but the truth was so much darker. The decision. Sitting at her kitchen table, Betty clutched a letter Monica had handed her a week ago, asking for help in secret. Monica's handwriting was shaky, as though she had been writing through tears, and yet the note had been filled with desperate urgency. "Betty, I need your help. There are things I've done, things I've been forced into that I cannot undo. The girls are in danger. I'm in danger. Please, don't let me become the monster they think I am." It was the kind of note that haunted a person, the kind of note that made you question your loyalty to a friend. Could Betty turn her back on Monica now, knowing what she knew? Could she walk away from the pain, knowing that the 2 innocent girls were caught in the middle of a web that was getting tighter by the day? Betty knew the right thing to do. She had to protect the children. Monica was a good mother. No one could take that from her. But if she was to save her daughters, Betty needed to bring the truth to light. But how could she? How could she stand in front of Monica and tell her that everything they had once shared, every secret and every bond, had to end? The confrontation. The day Betty decided to confront Monica came like an avalanche, unavoidable, powerful, and suffocating. She had spoken with the authorities, had gotten enough evidence to know the extent of the harm Monica had unknowingly caused by involving herself in dangerous dealings. The police were prepared to step in if necessary. Yet in her heart, Betty still clung to the idea that there could be another way. Could Monica ever truly come back from this? As Betty drove to Monica's house that afternoon, a storm was building in the sky. The dark clouds seemed to mirror the swirling chaos in her mind. She was going to confront her friend, the woman she had once trusted completely. Her heart ached at the thought of it. When she arrived, Monica was sitting in her living room, her face pale and strained. She didn't seem surprised to see Betty, though the sadness in her eyes spoke volumes. "I've been expecting you," Monica said quietly, her voice trembling. "I know what you found out." Betty stood in the doorway, her hands shaking. She had come prepared for this moment, but now, standing face to face with Monica, it all felt too real. "Monica, the girls told me everything. The drugs, the money, the men. Why didn't you come to me?" Betty's voice broke as the words spilled out. "You didn't have to do this alone." Monica's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Betty saw the weariness that had always been hidden behind her friend's cheerful exterior. "I didn't know who else to turn to," Monica whispered. "I thought if I just kept doing what they asked, they would leave us alone. I didn't want them to hurt my girls." Her voice cracked. "I thought I could protect them. I didn't realize how deep I was in until it was too late." Betty felt a pang of sorrow for her friend. She wanted so badly to understand. She wanted to believe that Monica hadn't crossed a line she couldn't come back from. But the facts were undeniable. The girls' safety had been compromised. No matter how much Betty cared for Monica, she couldn't stand by and watch the situation spiral out of control any longer. "I'm sorry, Monica, but I have to do this," Betty said softly. She reached into her bag and pulled out the papers she had collected, the ones that showed Monica's involvement with criminal figures. "The police are involved now. The girls are safe. It's over." Monica's face twisted in horror. "Betty, please. You can't do this to me. I made a mistake, but I'm not a monster." Betty's heart shattered at the pain in her voice. "I know, Monica. I know you never wanted this. But the girls need a future. They need a mother who can stand up for them, not someone trapped in a cycle of fear." Tears welled up in Monica's eyes. She stood up, reaching for Betty's hands. "Please, I never wanted them to get hurt. I didn't know how to stop it." Betty pulled her hands away gently, the decision final in her heart. "I know, Monica. I'm sorry." The aftermath. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, police visits, and quiet sobs. Monica had been arrested and charged, but Betty still couldn't rid herself of the weight of what had happened. She had lost her closest friend, and in some ways, she had lost herself too. She had done what was right, what was necessary, but it felt like betrayal. She couldn't help but wonder if there had been another way, a way that hadn't involved breaking everything they had ever known. But as she watched the twin girls begin their new lives, away from the toxic influence of their mother's choices, she knew she had made the right call. The damage was done, but there was still hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best she could do. Monica had made a choice, and in the end, Betty had made hers. In the distance, the clouds began to part, letting rays of sunlight shine through.